What does it take for someone to disappear without a trace? A woman with immense wealth, a future inheritance worth millions, a life filled with luxury, yet shadowed by whispers of deception and betrayal. On March 14, 2022, Melissa McCarthy walked out of a crowded Manhattan restaurant. She was expected at an important meeting the next morning, one that would solidify her control over a billion-dollar empire. But she never showed up. No phone calls, no sightings, no explanations. At first, it seemed impossible. A woman of her status, her resources gone just like that. But as investigators unraveled the final moments before she vanished, a picture emerged. One that suggested Melissa McCarthy may not have disappeared on her own. This is her story. Melissa McCarthy wasn't just wealthy. She was the sole heir to the McCarthy real estate dynasty, one of the most powerful families in the country. Her father, Richard McCarthy, had built a billion-dollar empire from the ground up, controlling some of the most valuable properties in New York. When he passed away, control of the company fell into a legal battle. Melissa was next in line, but not everyone agreed she deserved it. Her uncles, her cousins, even some of the company's board members, believed she was too reckless, too unstable to handle the responsibility. But legally, on her 36th birthday, she was set to inherit her full stake in the company. That birthday was just 2 weeks away, and then she was gone. The evening started like any other. Melissa had dinner at La Regence, an upscale French restaurant in Manhattan. She wasn't alone. She was seen dining with a man, later identified as Daniel Carter. A private investigator by profession, Carter had been hired by Melissa months prior for reasons still unclear. Waitstaff reported that Melissa seemed distracted, checking her phone repeatedly. She barely touched her food. At 9:47 p.m., she excused herself from the table and stepped outside for a call. Security footage shows her standing on the sidewalk, glancing around nervously. Then, at 9:52 p.m., she walked down the street. And that was it. She never returned to the restaurant. She never made it home, and no one saw her again. Melissa had a habit of disappearing for a day or two, especially when overwhelmed. Her closest friends assumed this was another one of those times. But when her assistant arrived at her apartment the next morning and found her phone on the kitchen counter, her car parked outside, and her purse sitting untouched on the table, panic set in. Something was wrong. By noon, calls to Melissa's phone went straight to voicemail. Messages were left unread. Even more disturbing, her last text, sent at 9:50 p.m., read simply, "Something isn't right. I need to leave. Now." But it was sent to a number that didn't belong to anyone she knew. By the time the police were involved, 48 hours had passed. Time was slipping away. If Melissa had been taken, every second counted. Authorities started by questioning Daniel Carter, the last person known to have seen her. He claimed that after Melissa stepped outside, she never came back. He waited for an hour before paying the bill and leaving. His story was plausible, but one detail raised suspicion. He never reported her missing. When asked why, Carter said Melissa had told him she was planning to leave town, that she felt unsafe, that she was being watched. Investigators pressed for more details. Who did she think was watching her? Carter hesitated before answering. Her family. To outsiders, the McCarthys were the definition of American success, wealthy, powerful, philanthropic. But beneath the polished image, their name was tied to scandals, lawsuits, and ruthless business tactics. Melissa had spent years battling them over her inheritance. They tried to control her, called her unstable, and even attempted to strip her of her claim. But legally, they couldn't. The trust fund set up by her father was ironclad. Unless she was no longer there to claim it. By the third day of Melissa's disappearance, investigators started looking deeper into her family, and what they found changed the course of the investigation. Multiple restraining orders. Melissa had taken legal action against her own relatives, accusing them of intimidation and harassment. Financial irregularities. In the weeks before she disappeared, someone tried to access her trust fund without her authorization. A hidden offshore account. Investigators uncovered an $80 million account in her name, one she never mentioned to friends or lawyers. Had someone found out about this money? Was she planning to escape? Or was this account the reason she was targeted? On March 17th, 3 days after Melissa vanished, a major discovery was made. In an abandoned parking lot in Queens, a burned-out black Range Rover was found. The license plate was missing, the interior charred beyond recognition. But beneath the debris, officers found a single silver bracelet, the one Melissa was last seen wearing. If this was her vehicle, one question loomed over everything. Where was the body? By the end of that week, Melissa McCarthy's disappearance was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a crime. But whether she was alive, hiding, or already dead, no one knew. Her family denied involvement. Daniel Carter refused to speak further. And the only real clue, a burned-out car, provided no real answers. But investigators weren't done. Because just as the media storm around Melissa's case was reaching its peak, an anonymous source came forward with something no one expected. A surveillance video. One that showed Melissa McCarthy on the night she vanished. One that showed her running, and she wasn't alone. What if everything you thought about a missing persons case was wrong? Melissa McCarthy was presumed to have disappeared without a trace. Investigators suspected foul play, a kidnapping, or worse. But then, a video surfaced, one that shattered every theory built so far. Because in this video, Melissa wasn't being taken. She was running, and she wasn't alone. For days after Melissa vanished, an anonymous envelope arrived at the NYPD's Missing Persons Unit. Inside was a USB drive containing a 30-second surveillance clip, recorded the night Melissa disappeared. Investigators immediately recognized her. She was wearing the same outfit from the restaurant: black designer coat, heels, silver bracelet. The footage, captured by a security camera outside a closed convenience store, showed her at 9:55 p.m., just minutes after she walked out of Law Regents. She wasn't walking calmly. She wasn't being forced into a car. She was sprinting down the street, glancing back frantically. And then, out of the darkness, a man appeared behind her. The figure was partially obscured, but he was tall, dressed in dark clothing and moving fast. Melissa's face was visible for a split second, her mouth open as if she was shouting something. Then the video cut out. The envelope had no return address, no note, no fingerprints. Whoever sent it didn't want to be found. The timestamp on the footage placed Melissa just 6 blocks away from the restaurant. That meant she had made it on foot. No sign of a car or anyone forcibly taking her. But if she was running, the obvious question was, from who and why? With this new lead, investigators refocused their efforts. They needed to understand exactly what was happening in Melissa's life before she vanished. And what they found made things even more complicated. Her lawyer's warning 3 weeks before her disappearance, Melissa's attorney had warned her not to go anywhere alone. A suspicious wire transfer a day before she vanished. Someone withdrew $500,000 from one of Melissa's accounts. A mysterious call at 9:30 p.m. on March 14th. Melissa received a phone call that lasted less than 20 seconds. The number was unregistered. None of these details were in her original missing persons file. Now, investigators had a new theory. Melissa McCarthy might not have been kidnapped. She might have been running for her life. Analyzing the video frame by frame, detectives noticed a small but crucial detail. The man chasing Melissa was wearing gloves. Not a common sight on a mild March night in Manhattan. That meant he was trying to avoid leaving fingerprints. Someone had been following her, and this wasn't random. The image quality was poor, but one thing stood out. A scar on the man's left hand, just visible in a single frame when he moved under a street lamp. Investigators ran the footage through facial recognition databases, criminal records, private security firms, but no match. Whoever he was, he wasn't in any known system. Then a breakthrough. A bartender working the same block that night came forward. He hadn't seen Melissa, but he remembered the man, because he wasn't alone. According to the witness, the man in the video had been talking to someone else earlier that evening. A second man, shorter, heavier, wearing a baseball cap. They were seen together at a bar near La Regents at 8:30 p.m. which meant Melissa was being watched long before she left the restaurant. This wasn't a random attack. It was planned. And that raised an even bigger question: who wanted Melissa gone? By this point, Melissa's disappearance was headline news. Reporters camped outside McCarthy estate homes, business headquarters, even her mother's gated mansion in Connecticut. The McCarthy family issued a statement, calling her disappearance tragic and urging anyone with information to come forward. But behind closed doors, they weren't cooperating. Her uncle refused to give police access to family financial records. Her cousin declined to answer questions about the company's board meeting the day after she vanished. Her mother avoided all media, refusing to make a public plea. To investigators, it was clear the family knew more than they were saying. But why weren't they helping? While investigators worked on identifying the two men in the video, forensic experts examined the burned Range Rover found in Queens. At first, it seemed useless: no fingerprints, no DNA, no personal belongings. Whoever torched the car knew exactly what they were doing. But then, in a small crevice under the passenger seat, something was found. A shard of plastic. It looked like nothing, charred and misshapen from the fire. But under UV light, a partial logo was visible. A hotel keycard. A luxury hotel. One that Melissa McCarthy checked into 2 days before she vanished. Rushing to the hotel, detectives requested access to the room registered under Melissa's name, room 1102. The staff confirmed she had checked in, but there was one problem. She was never alone. Security logs showed a second keycard was issued, and someone else entered that room after Melissa disappeared. Checking surveillance, investigators froze the footage at 11:37 p.m. on March 14th. A man in dark clothing, the same build as the one from the video, was seen walking out of room 1102. But this time, his face was fully visible, and investigators recognized him immediately. The man was Daniel Carter, the same private investigator who dined with Melissa at La Regence, the last person known to have seen her, and now the prime suspect in her disappearance. How well do you really know the people closest to you? Melissa McCarthy had secrets, ones she never shared with friends, family, or even the public. But there was one person she did confide in. One person she trusted with everything. Daniel Carter. He was her advisor, confidant, and the last person seen with her. Now, he was the prime suspect in her disappearance. The moment investigators identified Daniel Carter as the man leaving room 1102, they dug deeper into his background. On paper, he was a high-profile private investigator, someone who worked with the McCarthy family for years handling discreet matters. He specialized in corporate fraud, internal security, and keeping scandals buried. But Daniel wasn't just an investigator. He was also a former cop. And when detectives pulled his service record, they found something deeply unsettling. 2015. Suspended from the NYPD for excessive force during an interrogation. 2016. Left the force and started working for private clients, mostly high-net-worth individuals. 2018. Connected to a missing persons case involving a socialite who was never found. There was one constant in all his cases. He operated in shadows, cleaned up problems, and erased trails. And now, the one person Melissa turned to for protection was the same man who might have made her disappear. Detectives retraced Melissa's final hours before she vanished. She checked into the Langston Hotel on March 12th, 2 days before she disappeared. It wasn't unusual. She often stayed in hotels during business negotiations. But what was unusual was that she didn't check in alone. Hotel records showed that Daniel Carter had a duplicate keycard, meaning he had access to her room at all times. And according to housekeeping records, something even stranger happened. On March 14th at 3:20 p.m., Melissa ordered room service for two. But just 2 hours later, at 5:45 p.m., she made a request that made no sense. She asked hotel security to change the locks on her room. She didn't explain why. She didn't request a room change. She only said one thing: "I need to make sure no one else can get in." The locks were changed. Yet somehow Daniel Carter still entered that room after Melissa vanished. How? At first, Daniel claimed ignorance. When investigators brought him in for questioning, he stuck to his story. He had dinner with Melissa at La Regence. They talked about business, security threats, and her inheritance. She left the restaurant alone. He went home, but there was a problem. His cell phone data told a different story. His phone never left Manhattan that night, but it also didn't go straight home. Instead, it pinged near the Langstone Hotel at 11:15 p.m., 40 minutes after Melissa was last seen running on surveillance footage. That was the exact time someone entered room 1102. And it got worse. Security footage from the hotel parking lot showed Daniel's car pulling out at 1:42 a.m. He wasn't just at the hotel that night. He stayed there for hours. Detectives confronted Daniel with the evidence. His story fell apart. But just as they were about to push harder, something unexpected happened. Daniel lawyered up. And not just any lawyer, Jonathan Reese. Reese was one of the most powerful attorneys in New York, known for representing corporate giants and billionaires in high-stakes cases. He had no reason to protect Daniel Carter, unless someone very powerful wanted Daniel off the hook. With Daniel refusing to talk, detectives turned their focus back to Melissa. What exactly was she so afraid of before she vanished? Her personal email gave them the answer. 2 weeks before she disappeared, Melissa sent an encrypted message to an anonymous recipient. The subject line was only 3 words. "I have proof." The email itself was brief. "They think I don't know, but I do. I need to be careful. I'll send everything soon." Attached to the email was a single file, labeled inheritance_confidential.pdf. The document was gone, deleted before detectives could recover it. But one thing was clear: Melissa had discovered something big, something that put her life in danger. And Daniel Carter was right in the middle of it. Detectives searched Melissa's apartment, office, and hotel room for any trace of the missing document. They found nothing. But then, in her hotel nightstand, they found an empty case, one meant for an external hard drive. The hard drive itself was missing, and when they checked hotel security logs, they found one entry that stood out. At 12:10 a.m., just an hour after Melissa disappeared, a key card was used to enter room 1102. The person wasn't Melissa. It wasn't housekeeping. It was Daniel Carter. He had taken something from her room, something that might have been worth killing for. As investigators examined Daniel's connections, they made another shocking discovery. Daniel wasn't the only person visiting Melissa at the Langstone Hotel. A second guest had checked in under a fake name. The reservation was made under Michael Laird, but the ID used at check-in was fake. The credit card? Untraceable. Yet surveillance showed that Michael Laird entered Melissa's room on March 13th. And when detectives finally identified him, it sent the investigation in a direction no one expected. Because Michael Laird wasn't just anyone. He was Melissa McCarthy's half-brother. The same half-brother who had been disinherited from the McCarthy fortune. The same man who, according to bank records, had been in deep financial trouble. And now he was missing too. What if the person you feared the most was your own flesh and blood? For Melissa McCarthy, money was never just about luxury. It was about power, about control, and about the family empire built on secrets most people would kill to protect. Her half-brother, Christopher McCarthy, knew this better than anyone, because while Melissa was set to inherit billions, he was left with nothing. Now, he had checked into the same hotel where she vanished, under a fake name, and just like Melissa, Christopher was missing too. Christopher McCarthy had spent his entire life in the background, overshadowed by his sister, shut out of the McCarthy empire, and barely acknowledged in public. Unlike Melissa, he had no boardroom presence, no high-profile business deals, no lavish lifestyle. But he had something else. Debt. In 2019, Christopher borrowed $2.5 million from a private investor in an attempt to start his own company. By 2021, the business had collapsed, and he was drowning in lawsuits. By 2024, his assets were frozen, and creditors were coming after him. But then, something changed. Just 6 weeks before Melissa's disappearance, Christopher did something no one expected. He hired a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. the same lawyer representing Daniel Carter. Security footage from the Langstone Hotel revealed that Christopher entered the building on March 13th at 9:47 a.m. He checked in under the alias Michael Laird. Then, at 10:15 a.m., he took the elevator to the 11th floor, straight to room 1102, Melissa's room. No one was expecting him. No lunch meeting. No business deal. Just a brother and sister behind closed doors, arguing for over an hour. And then Christopher walked out. Melissa didn't. 2 days later, Melissa vanished. 2 days later, her half-brother vanished too. And now, investigators were asking the only question that mattered. What was on that missing hard drive? Forensics combed through Melissa's email history, and after weeks of decryption, they found something chilling. An unsent message drafted the night before she disappeared. The subject line? "I have it." The email was addressed to herself. "I'm right. I know I am. They think they covered it up, but I found it. This proves everything. If anything happens to me, check the drive." But the hard drive was gone, and so was the only other person who might have known what was on it. Christopher McCarthy. Then the case took a turn no one saw coming. At 2:36 a.m. on April 2nd, 3 weeks after Melissa disappeared, a 911 call came in from an untraceable number. The voice on the line, a man, panicked, out of breath. "I don't have much time. They know. They know. I tried to warn her." Dispatch. "Sir, who are you? Are you in danger?" "Melissa. She had the drive. They took it." The call was cut out. It lasted 13 seconds. Investigators traced the signal, but it bounced through multiple towers. The last known location was a parking lot near the docks. When they arrived, they found nothing. No phone, no caller, no Christopher McCarthy. With no hard evidence, no ransom demands, and no bodies, the case stalled. So, detectives turned to the one person who seemed to know everything. Jonathan Reese. The attorney represented both Daniel Carter and Christopher McCarthy. Reese was one of the most untouchable lawyers in the country. His firm handled the elite billionaires, CEOs, politicians. He never lost a case, and he never talked. But when investigators questioned him, they weren't prepared for what he said next. He laughed. Then, he leaned in and whispered, "You're asking the wrong questions." Then he walked away. With every lead running cold, investigators had one last shot. Melissa's bank records. A week before she disappeared, she made a single wire transfer. $1.2 million. The recipient? An offshore account under a company no one had ever heard of. A shell company, created 48 hours before Melissa vanished. And when detectives finally traced it back, they found something shocking. The account had only 2 authorized users. One was Melissa McCarthy, the other, Daniel Carter. She thought she had control of the situation. But what if the control was never hers to begin with? Melissa McCarthy, heiress to a multi-billion-dollar fortune, had spent her life guarding her family's secrets. Yet, in the end, it wasn't the world she needed to fear. It was her own blood. Christopher McCarthy, her half-brother, the man she thought she could trust, was playing a game with stakes so high, even he didn't know how deep it would go. But he wasn't the only one. There were others, powerful others, people who had everything to lose if Melissa revealed what was on that hard drive. And now, as the investigation took another unexpected turn, no one, not even the police, could have predicted what they would uncover. The McCarthy family had always been known for secrecy, a legacy built on more than just wealth. There were rumors that old money came with old debts, debts that would cost more than anyone was willing to admit. But those rumors were never proven. Until now, Detective Sarah Matthews, leading the investigation, had spent weeks combing through old family records and property files. Every lead seemed to be a dead end. But then, something caught her eye. A small, seemingly insignificant document buried deep within a fireproof file cabinet in McCarthy Enterprises' vault. The document was titled, Agreement of Silence, 1985. It was signed by Gerald McCarthy, Melissa's father, and several high-profile individuals who had no business being connected to the McCarthy family at all. One of those names stood out: Jonathan Heiress, the lawyer representing both Daniel Carter and Christopher McCarthy. The more Sarah dug, the more pieces began to fall into place. The agreement, signed in 1985, was a non-disclosure deal made between Gerald McCarthy and several business associates. It involved a massive cover-up of a corporate scandal that threatened to bring down McCarthy Enterprises. The document contained names of several high-powered individuals, people connected to the world of finance, politics, and even organized crime. And one of the signatories was none other than Jonathan Heiress. Sarah realized that the real secret was far darker than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just about inheritance. It wasn't just about money. It was about the secrets Melissa had uncovered on that hard drive. Secrets that were far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Just as Sarah started to connect the dots, another shocking discovery was made. Daniel Carter, the fiancé of Melissa McCarthy, was deeply involved in something much bigger. 2 months before Melissa disappeared, Daniel had made several trips to the Caribbean, where he had met with some of the names listed in the 1985 agreement. His meetings had been disguised as business conferences, but records showed he had been in the same places as some of the most notorious figures connected to money laundering and illegal arms deals. Was Daniel, who had always been the charming and seemingly trustworthy fiancé, involved in a much larger scheme? And if so, did he know something about Melissa's disappearance? But what about Christopher? Sarah had believed that Christopher McCarthy was merely a pawn in this complex game. But as she looked deeper into his background, the truth began to surface. Christopher was far more involved in this web of corruption than anyone realized. It turned out that Christopher wasn't just a disgruntled family member. He was an active participant in deals and shady transactions going back years. His debts weren't just a result of bad investments. They were the result of deals with some of the most dangerous criminals in the world. And now, with his disappearance, it was becoming clear. He hadn't just run from his problems. He had fled the country, leaving everyone behind to clean up the mess he'd created. Sarah wasn't the only one investigating these dark corners of the McCarthy family. In a twist no one could have predicted, an anonymous source reached out to the police. This person claimed to have a copy of Melissa McCarthy's will, a will that had never been made public. When it was finally examined, Sarah and the team were stunned. The will wasn't just a document detailing Melissa's assets. It was a bombshell. Melissa had disinherited her entire family, except for one person, Jonathan Heiress, the same lawyer who had been representing both Christopher and Daniel, the same lawyer who had been tight-lipped throughout the investigation, was listed as the primary beneficiary of her estate. But why? Why would Melissa, who had always kept her family at arm's length, choose Heiress over her own blood? What had happened between them in the weeks leading up to her disappearance? And what did Heiress know about the secrets locked away in McCarthy Enterprises? As the investigation continued, the final piece of the puzzle was revealed. A security camera from the parking lot near the docks where Christopher McCarthy was last seen. The camera had captured a disturbing image. A figure standing in the shadows, holding a large bag. The figure was too far away to identify, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was Jonathan Heiress. And the bag? It was later discovered to be full of documents, confidential papers from McCarthy Enterprises. It was all coming together now like a puzzle with pieces that had never made sense. But suddenly, they did. Every shadow, every deceit, every half-truth from the past few months led to this moment. The moment that would finally reveal what had happened to Melissa McCarthy. But this was no ordinary truth. It was a truth that would tear a family apart, expose secrets that could never be undone, and uncover a conspiracy so deep and dangerous, no one would leave unscathed. Melissa had vanished, yes, but what was she running from? And more importantly, who was running from her? After the discovery of Jonathan Heiress's involvement in the McCarthy family's darkest secrets, Detective Sarah Matthews knew this case was no longer about a missing woman. It was about protecting the truth, even at the risk of her own life. The will, the missing documents, the witnesses, it was all pointing back to one thing. Melissa had known too much. The closer Sarah got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. Heiress's influence reached further than anyone had imagined, and powerful allies had stepped in, willing to do whatever it took to keep this family's secret buried. It was the final night before the big breakthrough, the moment Sarah had been preparing for. A final confrontation was inevitable. But this time, Sarah wasn't alone. She had a surprise ally, Detective Tom Heiress, a colleague who had been quietly investigating the McCarthy family for years. His hunches had led him to believe that the entire McCarthy legacy was built on corruption that went beyond family squabbles and inheritance disputes. And it was this legacy that was beginning to break apart. The missing hard drive had always been the key. It was more than just incriminating evidence. It contained details of a deal so massive it could bring down entire industries. But the truth wasn't just about corporate malfeasance. It was about Melissa McCarthy herself, about a woman who had, for the first time in her life, chosen to fight back. Sarah dug into Melissa's final days. She tracked her movements, her phone records, the last conversations she had before her disappearance. She found a disturbing pattern. A week before she vanished, Melissa had contacted several people, warning them that the truth was coming out, that someone was going to take the fall for what had been hidden for so long. And that someone was Jonathan Heiress. But why Heiress? Turned out Heiress wasn't just her lawyer. He had been entangled in the same scandal she had uncovered, the scandal that involved the money laundering, illegal arms deals, and the international criminal syndicate that had been infiltrating McCarthy Enterprises for years. And Melissa had known. As Sarah sat in her office, piecing together the information, the unthinkable happened. An anonymous tip came through the police department, telling them that Jonathan Heiress had fled the country, likely on a private jet. It was all happening too fast. But this wasn't just about Heiress anymore. It was about Christopher. It was about the family that had profited from deception and violence for decades. The more Sarah learned, the more she realized that Heiress was only a small part of a larger puzzle. A puzzle that had been meticulously orchestrated by someone much closer to home. It was Christopher McCarthy. Christopher wasn't just running from his own debt. He was part of a devious plan to ensure that the family fortune remained intact. If Melissa had gone public with the information on that hard drive, it would have destroyed everything that Christopher had worked to build. But what about Daniel Carter, Melissa's fiancé? The truth was far darker than anyone had imagined. Daniel had been working with Christopher all along. His role wasn't just to distract Melissa, but to keep her close enough to prevent her from discovering the true extent of the family's crimes. It was in a secret meeting in the dead of night, a few days before the police could track him down, that Jonathan Heiress finally admitted it all. He wasn't working for the McCarthy family. He was working with them, with Christopher, with Daniel, and with a vast network of individuals who were part of the international criminal organization Melissa had discovered. Heiress had never intended to help Melissa. He had always planned to shut her down once and for all, but her intelligence and her courage had left him with no choice but to eliminate her. And so, the night Melissa vanished, Heiress, along with Christopher and Daniel, had staged her disappearance. They made it look like she had run away, but the truth was far more twisted. They'd taken her, kept her hidden to ensure she never revealed what she knew. But Heiress's admission came too late. The damage had already been done. Just as the police were about to arrest Heiress and his accomplices, another shocking turn came. Melissa McCarthy was found. But it wasn't the way anyone expected. Melissa had managed to escape, but in a desperate move to protect herself and expose the truth, she'd vanished again. But this time, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. She was alive, and she had left behind enough evidence to destroy the McCarthy legacy once and for all. Christopher McCarthy, Daniel Carter, and Jonathan Heiress were arrested, charged with multiple crimes, including murder, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Their involvement in the international criminal syndicate was exposed, and the McCarthy fortune was dissolved, leaving behind a trail of destruction. As for Melissa McCarthy, her fate remained uncertain. Some believe she disappeared to live a life of freedom, while others suspect she was forced into hiding for the rest of her days. But one thing was clear: the truth had been uncovered, and it had shattered the world of the McCarthy family forever.